Spring in Ohio has a particular quality, the way the afternoon light filters through budding trees, how the air carries both the lingering chill of winter and the promise of warmth. It's what I'd been missing during 4 years at university in Arizona, where seasons blur into variations of heat. As I drove along the familiar roads of my hometown, windows down to catch that distinctive Midwestern breeze, I felt a sense of completion, a circle closing. 25 years old, architecture degree in hand, I was returning to the foundation from which I'd built myself. My name is Connor Reeves. The first in my family to finish college, my graduation had been a solitary affair. My parents hadn't attended. Dad's back was acting up again. Mum couldn't leave work, the usual litany of practical obstacles that had characterized our relationship since I left home. Their absence hadn't surprised me. Their pride manifested not in attendance at ceremonies, but in quieter ways. Or so I'd always told myself. Maple Avenue hadn't changed much since I'd left. The McGregor's fence still leaned precariously to the left. The Wilsons' maple trees, for which the street was named, still formed a canopy overhead. But as I turned the final corner, approaching the place where our blue two-story house once stood proud under the ancient oak tree my grandfather had refused to cut down when he built the place, I felt the world shift beneath me. I slowed the car to a crawl, then stopped entirely, confusion overwhelming me. The house was still there, but it wasn't ours anymore. Fresh paint, a trendy slate grey, replacing the periwinkle blue I'd helped my grandfather apply the summer before he died. New landscaping where Mum's haphazard flower beds once sprawled, and a stranger, a man perhaps my age, mowing the lawn with methodical precision. But what made my stomach drop were the black trash bags piled unceremoniously at the curb. Even from the car, I could recognize my things. The corner of a poster jutting from a torn bag, a baseball trophy toppled onto the sidewalk. The spring rain had soaked through everything, turning the cardboard boxes beneath to sodden pulp. I stepped out of my car in a daze, rain immediately plastering my hair to my forehead. The man mowing the lawn noticed me, killed the engine, and approached with the wariness of someone greeting a stranger loitering outside their home. "Can I help you?" he asked, polite but firm. This is my house," I said stupidly, gesturing at the building that clearly wasn't mine anymore. Recognition dawned in his eyes. "You must be Connor," he said, his posture relaxing slightly. "Your parents mentioned you might stop by. They moved out last week, said you wouldn't be needing any of this stuff." He gestured toward the pile at the curb, a flicker of discomfort crossing his face. "They told us to give you their new address if you came around." He disappeared inside momentarily, returning with a slip of paper bearing an address in Hartsville, 2 towns over. I took it automatically, still struggling to process the scene before me. "When did they sell the house?" I managed to ask, rain dripping from my chin. "Closing was about 6 weeks ago. We've been renovating since then." He hesitated. "Look, I'm sorry about your stuff. They told us the garbage collection was today, but it got pushed back because of the holiday weekend." Another pause. "Do you want to take anything before it gets picked up tomorrow?" I stared at the rain-soaked remnants of my childhood. My architecture sketches, carefully preserved since I was 12, now bleeding ink into puddles. Books warped beyond recognition, clothes I'd left behind that no longer belonged to anyone. "Thank you," I said mechanically. "I'll just grab a few things." I spent the next hour in the rain, sifting through the debris of my former life. Most was ruined, but I salvaged what I could. A weatherproof case containing my grandfather's drafting tools, a few photographs in plastic sleeves, the medal I'd won in the state architectural design competition that had secured my scholarship. The new homeowner, Josh, he eventually introduced himself as, brought out garbage bags for me to repack what could be saved, his discomfort with the situation evident. "We had no idea they were just dumping your stuff," he said at one point, holding an umbrella over me as I knelt in the muddy grass. "My wife and I thought everything had been cleared with you." I nodded, unable to explain what I didn't understand myself. My parents had sold our home, my grandfather's home, without a word. They'd thrown away my possessions like refuse, and they'd moved to a different town, leaving no forwarding address except with the strangers who had purchased our house. When I had salvaged what I could, pitifully little fitting in the trunk of my sedan, I stood on the sidewalk, rain still falling steadily, staring at the house that had been the only stable element of my childhood. The wide front porch where Grandpa and I would sit during summer thunderstorms, watching nature's fury while remaining perfectly dry. The bay window where Mom would sometimes sit to read when the light was good. The oak tree that had stood sentinel over 3 generations of Reeves family life. None of it was mine anymore. I had returned to find myself homeless, dispossessed not by circumstance, but by choice, my parents' choice, made without my knowledge or consent. "Do you have somewhere to stay tonight?" Josh asked, genuine concern in his voice. I nodded automatically, though I had no idea where I would go. "Thank you for your help," I said, extending my hand. He took it, the awkwardness between us impossible to overcome. He, the unwitting beneficiary of my displacement. Me, the stranger claiming emotional ownership of his legal property. As I drove away from Maple Avenue, following the directions to the address in Hartsville, I felt a hollowness expand within me. It wasn't just anger, though, that simmered beneath the surface. It wasn't even betrayal, though that would come later. It was the profound disorientation of someone who discovers that their foundation, literal and metaphorical, has been removed without warning. The drive to Hartsville took 40 minutes, each passing mile adding clarity to my thoughts. By the time I pulled up to the small ranch-style house with my parents' familiar sedan in the driveway, the initial shock had crystallized into something harder. I sat in my car for several minutes, rain drumming on the roof, gathering myself for whatever came next. Their expressions when they opened the door told me everything. Not surprise. They'd known this moment would come eventually. Not joy at seeing their only son after 4 years of minimal contact, just resignation, tinged with the defensive guilt of those caught in an indefensible act. "Connor," my mother said, stepping back to let me in. "You're soaking wet. Let me get you a towel." The house was small but newly furnished, a leather sectional that didn't match their taste, a dining set I'd never seen, photos on the wall, carefully curated moments from their life, most of which didn't include me. "Where's all your old furniture?" I asked, as my mother handed me a towel. "We sold most of it," my father answered from his recliner, the one familiar piece in the room. "Downsizing, you know, less to take care of." I dried my hair mechanically, taking in the strange surroundings. "Were you going to tell me you'd moved?" My mother glanced at my father, a silent communication passing between them. "We were going to call once you'd graduated," she said. "We didn't want to distract you from your finals." The absurdity of this statement, as if a phone call about selling my childhood home would be more disruptive than returning to find it gone, nearly made me laugh. Instead, I asked the question that had been burning since I'd turned onto Maple Avenue. "Why did you sell the house?" My father shifted in his recliner, a gesture I recognized from childhood confrontations. "It was just a house, Connor," he said, echoing my mother's earlier words. "Too big for just the two of us. The property taxes were killing us. We needed the money. But it wasn't just a house." The words caught in my throat as I looked between them, searching for recognition of what they'd done. It was my grandfather's legacy, the home he'd built with his own hands after returning from Korea, the place he'd raised my father, the property that had remained in our family for 3 generations. "What about my things?" I asked. My mother had the grace to look ashamed. "We kept what seemed important," she said, gesturing to a small box in the corner, a pathetically inadequate container for a lifetime of possessions. "The rest, well, we thought you'd have new things now, adult things." I felt something break inside me then, not just anger, but the deep, irreparable fracture that comes with the realization that blood doesn't always guarantee loyalty, that the people who gave you life might not recognize its value. "You could have called," I said, my voice sounding distant to my own ears. "You could have warned me. You could have asked." "You were off chasing your degree," my father said, a note of bitterness creeping into his tone. "Never calling unless you needed money for books or supplies. What did it matter where we lived when you came back?" The implication stung, that my education, my achievement, my growth somehow severed my right to home, that in reaching beyond our family's boundaries, I had forfeited my place within them. I set the damp towel down on their new coffee table. "Grandpa left that house to me in his will," I said quietly. "He told me before he died that it would be mine after college, that I could start my practice there like he did." A flicker of something, guilt perhaps, or fear, crossed my father's eyes. "Your grandfather had ideas about a lot of things," he said dismissively, "but the house was in our name. Has been since he got sick." The certainty in his voice made me doubt my own memory. Had I misunderstood? Had Grandpa's promise been just wishful thinking, a dying man's unenforceable desire? That night, I slept in my car outside a Walmart, rain still pounding the roof, unwilling to accept my parents' reluctant offer of their couch. As I drifted into uneasy sleep, I thought of my grandfather's words the last time I'd seen him alive. "Remember, Connor, a house is more than walls and a roof. It's the truth you build inside it. I hadn't understood then what truth he meant. Now homeless on my first night back from university, I was beginning to comprehend. Morning found me stiff and cold in the reclined driver's seat of my sedan, condensation beading the windows like tears. I'd slept fitfully, waking to each passing car in the Walmart parking lot, each distant voice. The reality of my situation settled over me with the grey Ohio dawn. I was effectively homeless, my possessions reduced to what I could salvage from rain-soaked garbage bags, my family relationships fractured beyond my comprehension. I drove to a nearby diner, ordered coffee I couldn't taste, and tried to make sense of the previous day's revelations. My grandfather's words about the house being mine after graduation echoed persistently, yet my father's certainty that the property had been in his name contradicted this memory. I needed clarity, needed to understand if what had been taken from me was legally mine to reclaim. The first step was finding evidence. I connected to the diner's Wi-Fi and searched through my email archives, scrolling back through 4 years of university communications. If Grandpa had made formal arrangements, there might be some record, something beyond his verbal assurance. 3 cups of coffee later I found it, an email from James Dalton, my grandfather's attorney, dated 3 years earlier. It had arrived during finals week of my sophomore year, and I'd marked it to read later, then forgotten entirely in the blur of exams and summer internships. Dear Connor, it read, as executor of Harold Reeves's estate, I am writing to confirm the property transfer as stipulated in his will. The house at 1847 Maple Avenue has been placed in trust for you, with ownership transferring fully upon completion of your undergraduate degree. Your father will maintain residency rights until that time. Please contact my office to discuss the details of this arrangement at your earliest convenience. I stared at the screen, a strange mixture of vindication and deeper betrayal washing over me. My grandfather had indeed kept his promise, had legally ensured his home would pass to me, which meant my parents hadn't simply made a difficult financial decision. They had sold property that wasn't theirs to sell. They had committed fraud. The implications staggered me. I reread the email several times, searching for ambiguity, for some interpretation that would render my parents' actions merely inconsiderate rather than criminal. Finding none, I called the number in the signature block, not expecting an answer on a Saturday. To my surprise, James Dalton himself picked up. Mr. Dalton, this is Connor Reeves, Harold Reeves's grandson. There was a pause on the line. Connor, yes, of course. I've been trying to reach you for quite some time. His tone made my stomach tighten. About the house, I said, not a question. Yes. Another pause. I understand it was recently sold. Without my knowledge or consent, I confirmed, my voice steadier than I felt. I just found your email from 3 years ago, about the trust. I see. His voice took on the careful neutrality of an attorney, recognizing potential legal complications. Perhaps we should meet in person to discuss the situation. Are you in town? 2 hours later, I sat across from James Dalton in his modest downtown office. He was younger than I expected for my grandfather's attorney, perhaps mid-40s, with prematurely silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. The office walls displayed framed photographs of historic buildings throughout Ohio, architectural studies that resonated with my own passion. Dalton reviewed the documents spread before us, my grandfather's will, the trust arrangement, the property transfer documentation. Your grandfather was very specific, he explained, tapping the will. The house was to be held in trust until you completed your degree. Your parents were granted residency rights during that period, but ownership was legally yours, with the transfer becoming absolute upon graduation. I swallowed hard. So when they sold it? They sold something that wasn't legally theirs to sell, he confirmed, his expression grave. I discovered the sale quite by accident. A colleague mentioned it at a bar association meeting. I've been trying to contact you since then, but your university email had apparently expired. I graduated 3 weeks ago, I said numbly. I've been driving cross-country to get back here. Dalton nodded, his eyes reflecting genuine sympathy. Connor, I need to ask a difficult question. How do you want to proceed with this? Legally speaking, we have several options, but they all involve confronting your parents with potential criminal charges. The word criminal hung in the air between us, heavy with implications. These were my parents, flawed, distant, apparently dishonest, but still the people who had raised me. The prospect of seeing them face fraud charges was almost unthinkable, almost. What happened to the money from the sale? I asked. Dalton consulted his notes. The house sold for $287,000. After settling the remaining mortgage, approximately $210,000 would have been disbursed to the sellers. More than $200,000, the legacy my grandfather had intended for me, now presumably sitting in my parents' bank account, or worse, already spent. "I want the house back," I said quietly, surprising myself with the certainty of this decision. "Not the money, the house." Dalton leaned back in his chair, considering me. "That's potentially complicated. The new owners purchased in good faith. They're innocent parties in this." "I know," I acknowledged, thinking of Josh's kindness in the rain. "But it's not just about property value. My grandfather built that house. It's where he taught me about architecture, where I decided what I wanted to do with my life." I met Dalton's gaze directly. "It's the only home I've ever known." Something in my words seemed to resonate with him. He nodded slowly. "We can file for an emergency injunction to halt any further renovation or alteration of the property, then pursue a claim of fraudulent conveyance. Given the documentation we have, I believe the court would rule in your favor." "And my parents?" Dalton's expression softened slightly. "Fraud is a serious matter, Connor, but if the property is restored to you, and if they return the proceeds, a judge might consider leniency regarding criminal charges, especially if you, as the wronged party, don't push for prosecution." I thought of my mother's quiet shame when I'd asked about my possessions, my father's flicker of guilt when I'd mentioned Grandpa's promise. There had been awareness there, knowledge that what they'd done was wrong, not just legally but morally. "I want to go back to Maple Avenue," I said, rising from my chair with newfound purpose. "I need to speak to the new owners." Dalton gathered the documents carefully. "I'd advise against discussing specific legal details with them until we've filed the paperwork. But establishing communication is reasonable. Would you like me to accompany you?" I nodded, grateful for his support, for the validation that I wasn't overreacting or misunderstanding. As we drove separately back to my childhood street, I felt something shifting within me, the initial shock and hurt reconfiguring into resolve. My parents had sold something that wasn't theirs to sell, not just a house but my inheritance, my history, my grandfather's legacy. In doing so, they had broken not just the law, but the fundamental trust between parent and child, the trust that says, "I will protect what matters to you. I will honor the promises made in your name." As we pulled up to the newly grey house on Maple Avenue, I realized that what lay ahead wasn't just a legal battle for property rights. It was a reckoning with the truth my grandfather had tried to instill in me, that a house is more than walls. It's the integrity you maintain within them. Josh and his wife Emma greeted us at the door with visible apprehension. News travels quickly in small towns, and the arrival of a lawyer alongside the previous owner's son had clearly triggered concern. "We haven't done anything wrong," Emma said immediately as we settled in their living room. My living room, transformed by fresh paint and furniture I didn't recognize. "No one's suggesting you have," Dalton assured them, his tone professionally gentle. "You purchased this property in good faith." I studied them as Dalton explained the situation in carefully measured terms: a property held in trust, sellers who lacked legal authority, a grandson returning to claim his inheritance. Josh and Emma were young, probably close to my age, their expressions shifting from defensiveness to dismay as understanding dawned. "We put our entire savings into this house," Emma said quietly, her hand finding Josh's. "We can't afford to lose it." "The sale would be voided," Dalton explained, "with full restitution to you as the purchasers. You'd receive everything you've invested, including renovation costs." Josh looked around the room at the half-finished projects that represented their dreams. "We've been working on this place for 6 weeks, nights, weekends, every spare moment." His eyes met mine, frustration mingling with an unwilling empathy. "I get that this matters to you, but it matters to us too." I understood their position with painful clarity. They were collateral damage in my parents' deception, innocent parties who had committed to a future in this house just as I had. The difference was that my claim was backed by legal documentation and the explicit wishes of the man who had built these walls. "I spent my whole life in this house," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "My grandfather built it after coming back from Korea. He taught me architecture on that back porch. When he got sick, he made arrangements to ensure it would come to me after college." I gestured to the room around us. "This isn't just property to me. It's the only permanent home I've ever known." Something in my words reached them. Emma's expression softened while Josh sat back, conflict evident in his posture. "What happens now?" he asked, directing the question to Dalton. "We'll file for an injunction on Monday to halt further renovations while the case proceeds." Dalton explained. Given the documentation we have, I believe the court will rule in Connor's favor relatively quickly. And if we fight it? Josh asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. You could, Dalton acknowledged, but the trust documentation is unambiguous. You'd likely incur significant legal fees only to reach the same outcome. Silence settled over the room, heavy with the weight of disrupted lives. Finally, Emma spoke, her voice quiet but resolved. We need some time to process this, to talk about our options. Of course, Dalton nodded, rising from his seat. Here's my card. Feel free to have your attorney contact me directly with any questions. As we moved toward the door, I paused, unable to leave without addressing the human cost of this legal entanglement. I'm truly sorry about this, I told them. I never wanted my return to displace anyone else. Josh met my eyes, his initial hostility tempered by reluctant understanding. It's not your fault, he said finally. From the sound of it, your parents put all of us in this position. His words, though meant as a concession, twisted something inside me. The realization that in pursuing my rightful claim, I was forcing an innocent couple from their home. The moral complexity of the situation settled over me as we left, Dalton's car pulling away while I lingered on the sidewalk. The oak tree that had witnessed 3 generations of my family stood sentinel in the yard, its branches moving gently in the spring breeze. I thought of my grandfather sitting beneath it, teaching me about load-bearing structures and the importance of solid foundations, about the integrity required to build something lasting. That integrity now required me to face my parents with the evidence of their betrayal. I drove to Hartsville with Dalton's file on the passenger seat, each mile hardening my resolve. When I arrived at their rented ranch house, my father's truck was absent, but my mother's car sat in the driveway. She answered the door with a tightness around her eyes that suggested she'd been expecting this visit. You found out, she said simply, stepping back to let me enter. Why? I asked, the single word containing all the hurt and confusion of the past 24 hours. Why would you sell Grandpa's house when you knew it wasn't yours to sell? She sank onto the sofa, suddenly looking older than her 57 years. Your father handled the sale. He said the lawyer had taken care of the trust issue, that it had been dissolved. That lawyer's name was James Dalton, I said, placing his card on the coffee table between us. I met with him this morning. The trust was never dissolved. The house legally belongs to me. She stared at the card as if it might bite. Connor, you have to understand. After you left for college, things got difficult. Your father's back problems meant less work. Medical bills piled up. The house was too big, too expensive to maintain. So you sold my inheritance without telling me. I kept my voice level, fighting against the childish hurt that threatened to overwhelm my adult rationality. You threw away my possessions. You moved to a different town. Were you hoping I just wouldn't notice? Her silence was answer enough. They had gambled on my detachment, on the distance that had grown between us during my college years, had interpreted my focus on education as abandonment of home, using it to justify their own betrayal. Where's the money? I asked. She looked away, confirming my worst suspicions. Most of it's gone. Your father paid off his medical bills. We bought this place outright. New furniture, a boat. Her voice trailed off, the frivolity of their spending hanging in the air between us. Dalton's filing for an injunction on Monday, I told her, businesslike despite the emotional storm inside me. The sale will be voided. You and Dad will be required to return the money. We don't have it, she whispered, real fear entering her voice. Connor, they'll charge us with fraud. Your father could go to prison. The appeal to family loyalty, to protection despite their betrayal, twisted inside me like a knife. Part of me, the child who had once believed in their unconditional support, wanted to reassure her, to find some solution that would shield them from consequences. But the adult who had emerged through education, and now this crucible of betrayal, recognized the manipulation inherent in her fear. You had options, I said quietly. You could have told me about the financial struggles. We could have figured something out together. Instead, you chose to steal from me, to erase my history, to gamble that I'd never discover what you'd done. She had no answer for this, her gaze fixed on her clasped hands. I'll be staying at the Mapleview Motel, I told her, rising to leave. Tell Dad to call Dalton. There might still be a way to avoid criminal charges, but you need to cooperate fully. As I walked to the door, she called after me, her voice breaking. Connor, please, we're still your parents. I paused, the weight of our shared history, both the love and the betrayal, settling across my shoulders. Yes, I acknowledged, and I'll always be your son. But right now, that's not enough to make this right. Driving away, I realized that the true betrayal wasn't the sale of the house itself, it was the willingness to sacrifice my future for their present comfort, the casual discarding of not just my possessions, but my place in their world, a place my grandfather had tried to secure through legal means they had deliberately circumvented. That night in my motel room, I slept with Grandpa's drafting tools beside me, the one tangible connection to the man who had valued me enough to safeguard my inheritance. A house is more than walls, he had said. It's the truth you build inside it. The truth I now faced was painful but clarifying. The home I had lost wasn't just a structure on Maple Avenue. It was the illusion that family loyalty ran equally in all directions, that parents would protect what mattered to their child, as naturally as breathing. Tomorrow would bring legal proceedings, confrontations, the messy business of reclaiming what was rightfully mine. But tonight, in the quiet of a generic motel room, I mourned not just for the house, but for the family stories I had believed about ourselves, stories that had proven as vulnerable to reality as my rain-soaked sketches on the curb. Legal proceedings have a way of distilling life to its essential elements. In the weeks that followed my discovery, I learned this firsthand as my existence narrowed to 3 points: the motel room where I slept, Dalton's office where we prepared our case, and occasional drive-bys of the house on Maple Avenue, where Josh and Emma continued to live while the courts deliberated. My parents never appeared at the initial hearing. Dalton had served them with papers, explaining the gravity of the situation and offering a path toward potential leniency if they cooperated. Their response was silence, not just legal non-compliance, but complete withdrawal. Their rented house in Hartsville sat empty when I drove by, their vehicles gone, mail accumulating behind the door. They had fled rather than face the consequences of what they'd done. It doesn't help their case, Dalton explained, as we left the courthouse after the judge granted our preliminary injunction. Abandonment can be interpreted as admission of guilt. I felt hollowed out by their disappearance, not surprised exactly, but confronted with the final evidence that my parents' self-preservation would always outweigh their connection to me. The child in me had hoped irrationally that they might apologize, might acknowledge the harm they'd done. The adult recognized the childishness of that hope. Josh and Emma, meanwhile, had been unexpectedly gracious. After their initial shock, they had consulted their own attorney, who confirmed Dalton's assessment. Rather than dragging out a legal battle they couldn't win, they had begun looking for another house, accepting that their time on Maple Avenue would be temporary. "We understand it's your family home," Emma had told me when I ran into her at the local hardware store. "If the situations were reversed, I'd fight for mine too." Her kindness in the face of disruption only sharpened my awareness of the collateral damage my parents had caused. These strangers had shown more integrity in losing the house than my family had in selling it. 2 months after my return to Ohio, the final ruling came. The sale was declared void, with Josh and Emma to receive full reimbursement from the proceeds, which would be recovered from my absent parents when they were located. The house would revert to me as stipulated in my grandfather's trust. I stood alone outside the courthouse after the hearing, legal papers clutched in my hand, victory hollow in the absence of anyone to share it with. Dalton had other appointments. Josh and Emma had understandably chosen not to attend. My parents remained missing, their whereabouts unknown. The drive to Maple Avenue felt like returning to a memory rather than a physical place. Familiar yet somehow distant, as if the events of the past months had changed not just my relationship to the house, but the nature of the house itself. Josh and Emma's moving truck was parked in the driveway when I arrived. They had been given 30 days to relocate, but had found a place sooner, a craftsman bungalow across town that Emma had described as more their style anyway. They were loading the last of their furniture when I pulled up. "Perfect timing," Josh said without bitterness. "We were just finishing up." We stood awkwardly in what had been their living room, now empty of furniture, but bearing the marks of their brief ownership. Fresh paint, new light fixtures, refinished hardwood floors, improvements made to a home they would never fully inhabit. "I'm sorry it worked out this way," I said, meaning it deeply. "I never wanted to displace anyone." Emma shook her head. "Your parents did that, not you." She hesitated, then handed me a set of keys. "We changed the locks when we moved in. Security system code is 1847. We figured the house number was easy to remember." The simple practicality of this exchange, keys, security codes, the mundane details of home ownership, struck me with unexpected force. After months of legal abstractions, the physicality of those keys represented the tangible reality of reclamation. They left shortly after, the moving truck rumbling down Maple Avenue and out of sight. I stood alone on the porch, my porch once more, keys in hand, the weight of ownership settling over me like a familiar coat found after years of absence. The house was eerily quiet as I stepped inside, my footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors. Josh and Emma's renovations had changed the space. Walls I remembered as beige now painted in modern greys, fixtures updated, windows reframed. Yet beneath these cosmetic changes, the bones of the house remained unchanged. The solid craftsmanship my grandfather had built with his own hands. The structural integrity he had instilled in both building and grandson. I moved through each room slowly, reacquainting myself with spaces both familiar and transformed. The kitchen where Grandpa had taught me to make his famous pancakes. The dining room where we'd gathered for holidays before Mom and Dad's arguments made such gatherings unbearable. The small bedroom that had been mine since childhood, now bare of furniture, but still holding the invisible imprint of years spent dreaming of the man I would become. When I reached the back porch, the place where Grandpa and I had spent countless hours with drafting tools and dreams, I sat on the steps, overwhelmed by the confluence of past and present. The oak tree still stood sentinel in the yard, its branches casting dappled shadows across grass, now neatly trimmed by Josh's careful maintenance. From my pocket, I pulled the few items I'd salvaged from the rain-soaked bags my parents had left at the curb, Grandpa's mechanical pencil, the medal from the design competition, a water-damaged photograph of him standing proudly in front of the house the day it was completed, artifacts of a legacy nearly lost, now reclaimed. The legal battle had consumed my savings, delaying my plans to start an architectural practice. The house itself would need work to become both home and office as I'd once envisioned, and somewhere out there, my parents continued their flight from accountability, from family, from the truth of what they had done. Yet sitting on those porch steps as evening settled over Maple Avenue, I felt a curious sense of completion. The house was mine, as Grandpa had intended, not just legally but spiritually, claimed through struggle, through the conscious choice to fight for what mattered, through the painful recognition that sometimes family is defined not by blood, but by the integrity with which we honor our commitments to one another. I unpacked what little I had left, clothes in the trunk of my car, Grandpa's drafting tools, a few architecture books that had traveled with me to university and back. The rooms echoed with emptiness, the walls bare of decoration, the space waiting to be filled with new purpose. That night, I slept on a sleeping bag in what had been my childhood bedroom, the hardwood floor unyielding beneath me. Through the window, the oak tree's silhouette stood black against the star-filled sky, a constant amid change. In that moment between wakefulness and sleep, I swear the house seemed to settle around me, creaks and sighs, like an old friend welcoming me back. I had fought for these walls, these rooms, this legacy, had stood against betrayal to reclaim not just property, but principle. The house was mine, but more than that, I had reclaimed the part of myself they had tried to sell along with it, the self that believed in fighting for what matters, in honoring promises, in building foundations strong enough to withstand storms. As sleep finally claimed me, I whispered to the empty space, "I kept your promise, Grandpa. I brought our home back." The house stood silent around me, but in that silence was acknowledgement, recognition, return. If you've been moved by Connor's journey of resilience and reclamation, subscribe to my channel for more powerful stories that explore family dynamics, inheritance disputes, and the courage to stand up for what's rightfully yours. Each week, I share narratives that resonate with real emotional truth and provide insight into the human experience. Hit that subscribe button now to ensure you never miss a story that might change how you view your own family relationships.